state, the fact that Sharia became part of the state law, most of the time remnant of the family code, reshaped to match the need and the specificity of the state. And that's on that particular perception of Sharia that indeed you can claim an Islamic state. There is nothing in the Islamic tradition about the state being the preferred or privileged form of doing politics, right? So I really appreciate efforts like you that are trying to step away from that, because it's a very challenging, and you rightly said it's not only challenging for the non-Muslims, it's also challenging for Muslims who have been educated, socialized, I would say for more than a century now, in this kind of vision of Islam. So how do you propose through this book to reopen the path toward this diversity and toward a less, I would say, state-centered approach to governance? Because also, let's be clear here, governance doesn't mean automatically taking on the state. If you have local actions that can be readable by the state or political institution, it's also part of good governance. You don't need to win an election to do good governance. So what is your proposed path in this book in order to implement this governance outside of the state centrality, so to speak?
So there is a three-step argument that I try to make in the book. One is I try to reintroduce the idea of ihsan and its importance, and try to remind Muslims that this is the highest of our aspirations. Most branches of Muslim thought have only given lip service to ihsan. It is so ironic that my book starts with the hadith of Jibreel, and so does the work of Ibn Taymiyyah's Kitab al-Iman. But what was interesting is he focuses on Iman. He's obsessed with who is Muslim and who is not. And he just gives lip service to ihsan. The second point I wanted to make was that there is a juncture in Muslim history, and it could be pointed to the advent of modernity or colonialism, where there is a huge divergence between the past and the present. So when Muslims thought about Islam in the past, I articulate that they have Islamic theories of the state. So you have Al-Farabi advancing an Islamic theory of the state, where he envisages the state as a state which will be perfect, attain happiness. It will create a system where individuals will have the opportunity to perfect their souls. And I realized that even though he was using the word kamil constantly, perfection is also one of the meanings of ihsan. So he doesn't use the word ihsan, but he's also talking about perfection and moral development of the society and individuals. And then you have somebody like Ibn Khaldun, who is also talking of an Islamic state, but he's advancing Islamic knowledge, but about the state in general.
Yes.
Whereas in the modern period, instead of advancing Islamic theories of the state, people like Maududi and Sayyid Qutb and Nabhani and others have advanced theories of the Islamic state. So rather than Islamic thinking about the state, you now have thinking about the Islamic state. So what is problematized is not what kind of a polity should we have. That was Farabi's problem. That was Ibn Khaldun's concern. Even people like Mawardi and Ibn Taymiyyah were saying, what is a legitimate way of governing? What is a good way of governing? But the modern Muslim thinkers, especially who are persuaded that Islam should play a role in the public policy, they're not asking that question. They're not asking the question like, which is the best way to govern in the world today, in the postmodern world, in the age of globalization. They're only concerned with how can we create an Islamic state? Yes. That seems to be their goal. That seems to be the political goal. They do not ask the question, is the Islamic state the best response to the challenges of the Muslim world today? That is not part of the conversation at all. So they think it is the divine purpose of Muslims to to produce this Islamic State. And even the Islamic State is very narrowly defined. It is defined in the, it's like a combination of Al-Mawardi's Khilafah and Ibn Taymiyyah's Sharia. So they have this structure. If you look at their work clearly, it is a very severe, very even totalitarian, and also racist state. Al-Mawardi says basically that in an Islamic caliphate, only people from one particular tribe, the Quraysh, can be legitimate rulers. So if you're not a member of the Quraysh, then you can't be. And it is so astonishing that he attributes this to the first caliph Abu Bakr, and says Abu Bakr justified his governance by saying that the Prophet said that only people from the Quraysh can be rulers and the wazirs should be from people of Medina. I mean, how can we establish a governance system in Indonesia or Turkey where there are no Arabs? Forget about bringing Quraysh there. So Muslims, I mean, this is a few days after the Prophet gave the final khutbah in which he said there is no difference between an Arab and a non-Arab. And then you have a Khilafah system established immediately after his death, which is premised on the privileging of a particular tribal identity. And then when Ibn Taymiyyah comes, and I want to share this with you, and I want Muslims also to listen to this, he narrates a particular episode from the life of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in which he says that a man stole another man's mantle, a blanket, you may say. So the guy who owned the blanket caught the guy who stole the blanket and brought him to the Prophet, peace be upon him. And the Prophet said, since you stole the blanket, we should amputate your hand, and wanted to implement the Sharia. The man who owned the blanket was horrified at the idea that another man would lose a hand for just his blanket. So he said, I will gift him my blanket, basically to rescue him from that punishment. So it is quite obvious that even some of the companions of the Prophet were horrified by the severity of the punishment, and they thought it was not proportional, obviously. But the Prophet apparently insisted that forgiveness should have come before he reported it.
Mm.
And apparently, the Prophet insisted that the man's hand be amputated. And I'm looking at this story, and so Ibn Taymiyyah is making the case of imposing a very severe interpretation of Islamic law. And so you can see why ISIS is what ISIS is. The severity and the barbarity with which the ISIS were trying to implement Sharia law, throwing gay people from buildings, executing publicly, it's very strange. And the Quran says that we have sent Muhammad as nothing but mercy to humanity. And I'm wondering, where is that mercy and compassion and forgiveness? There are many verses in the Quran which says forgive. And so if this man was forgiving that person, what business does the state have of imposing it? So to me, this whole idea of this medieval conceptions of Sharia, etc., should be understood in the context in which they were articulated. Ibn Taymiyyah was like Sam Huntington, paranoid. Huntington was paranoid that Islam and China would get together and destroy the West, and Hispanic migration would destroy liberal democracy from inside. And Ibn Taymiyyah was also like that. He thought the Mongols and the Crusaders would destroy Islam from the outside, and Sufis and philosophers would destroy Islam from inside. So his interpretation of Islam is very insecure, very frightened, and very narrow, and something that is immune to reinterpretation. So that's the first thing I want Muslims to understand, that these are not our models for us to emulate. Our role model is the Prophet. And so I want people to move away from the model of the Khilafah and go to the model of the Medinan constitution, the 10 years of the Prophet's governance. And I read the 10 years of Prophet's governance in Medina as a state which had a constitution. The Prophet did not say, I'm the Prophet of God and so I rule over you. He ruled by virtue of consent. The constitution of Medina was both a consent from those who were governed and also a social contract on the basis of which the rights and duties of every community was articulated. So constitutionalism can be drawn from that, social contract, consent to govern. And what was also interesting and important to me was that this first Islamic state was a multi-ethnic, multi-religious state. So countries like France and Malaysia and India, these multi-religious, multi-ethnic states, should be able to draw direct lessons from the Prophet's governance. Islam is based on the message of God, the Quran, and the practice of Prophet Muhammad, not anybody else, not Ibn Taymiyyah, not Mawardi, and not even the Khulafa Rashidin. So that's the second part I want to do. The third message that I plan to suggest is this, that let's not focus about the structure so much. Like, it doesn't matter whether it's a liberal democracy, radical democracy, or what. What is important is the content of what is delivered in public service. So to me, the key questions are we delivering social justice? Are we delivering equity? You know, there are every Friday, Muslims end sermons by saying, "Inna Allah ya'muru bil adli wal ihsan." Indeed, God has commanded justice with ihsan. Justice with ihsan. So ihsan is mercy, compassion, and love. And justice is equality. So God is also saying that just justice is not enough. You have to have justice plus. And that should be the content. So when we articulate policies, those policies should be measured on these two parameters of justice and ihsan. Is it a beautiful policy? Is it compassionate? Is it merciful? Now, people think that these terms like forgiveness and compassion, etc., are just words. They do translate into policy, and you can see in the United States, for example, the laws about bankruptcy are essentially the codification of forgiveness at one point. It is like you're bringing forgiveness. This is coming from the Judeo-Christian tradition of forgiveness into the public system. So we have parole systems. These are all aspects of forgiveness. So I try to articulate in my last chapter certain shifts that Muslims should make in their thinking about politics. So for example, I talk about how to do Sharia through Shura. You know, Muslims think of Sharia as given and Shura as a process. But what I want to argue that what is Sharia should not be prior of Shura, but it should be the product of Shura. So you have a consultative process and ask, what is the Islamic ruling in this state? Tomorrow, I'm participating in a public discussion in Delaware on euthanasia. So there is a bill in the House, the state, about should we permit physician-assisted suicide for people who are in tremendous pain, etc. So what is the Islamic? So it's a consultative process. So the law is going to emerge after these public deliberations. And so I argue that one way to change this politics is for Muslims to come to the understanding that there are many ways of articulating what is Sharia, and let's debate that through the process of Shura and then come up with what is Sharia.
So what you are pointing out is actually a very painful situation of Islam today, which is the lack of understanding of history. And I would, for the sake of argument, push back a little on saying that Khilafah was totalitarian. Actually, all historical accounts show that the caliphate was not totalitarian. First, because it was not a state. I think we have to be clear here that the state is this modern institution of a central political power exerting control on a portion of territory. By all means, the empires from Abbasid to Ottoman were not, Umayyad, were not states. There was no as such a central power, except when the caliphate had to go to war. But the diversity was there, the plurality was there. It was a multilinguistic, multi-ethnic, multicultural, and it did include religious minorities. So of course, if we do anachronism and we think that this had to be equalitarian in the sense of secular, of course it didn't exist. But it didn't exist in Europe either. at the same time. So what I'm trying to tell here is that all what you are saying is actually in the Islamic tradition, not the modern understanding of tradition of the past, but the tradition in Islam,
Yes.
the method by which scholars and religious authority give meaning to communities locally and in all aspects of the empire. These communities were never for Muslims. The maslaha was not the state interest. The maslaha was the common good of the community that some guidance, since that some authority was guiding day to day, and it was indeed bottom up. So Sharia was not a law. Sharia was a way for religious authority to provide civility to local communities. And I think the issue is that that's what I try to show in my own work, is that with the end of the caliphate, historical caliphate, the rise of the nation state, young Muslim and even elderly Muslim are reading the caliphate through the lens of the nation state. But it has never been, because the nation state, as you said about nationalism being, it's an homogenization process. It means that the state did its best to create a connection between a certain brand of Islam, a certain ethnicity, and the state power. So I think that that's the issue here, because we are not looking at the past with indeed, you're absolutely right, saying relocating. We cannot look at even Ibn Taymiyyah, he spent his time in jail because what he was saying was not part of what indeed was the consensus of the time. So that's why the people of ISIS cannot reconnect with this past. They have not been educated into it. They have no clue what this means. They have not been taught their Islamic tradition. It may sound a little blunt to say it like that, but that's the issue right there. So what they duplicate is indeed an even more homogeneous political system than the nation state. And it is indeed totalitarian.
So see, the thing is that I'm not saying that the period of the Khilafah was totalitarian. I'm saying that if al-Mawardi's theory and the way Ibn Taymiyyah then picked it up is a totalitarian vision. So, for example, when you look at Mawardi or even Al-Qaeda or ISIS or even Nabhani's vision of the caliphate, some of them use the same caliphate to say Islam is democratic. Look, we elected the caliphs, right? But what they don't understand is they treat all the four caliphs as if it's a similar model. But if you notice, it's all different. The Prophet, peace be upon him, did not appoint a successor. Abu Bakr appointed a successor. Umar did not appoint a successor. He appointed an electoral college to elect the successor. And I think Uthman was prematurely assassinated before he could plan his succession. And so we don't have a plan. So if you notice, the entire period of the Khilafah is more innovative.
Yes.
And responding to times and circumstances than trying to implement some imaginary, socially constructed conception of the Khilafah or Islamic law. And that is very important. So, for example, what to call the caliphs? Like, they didn't know what to call each other. And so it was, I think, Imam Ali who recommended to the second caliph that, well, you are the commander of the faithful. So instead of calling yourself the Khalifa of Rasulullah, I mean, it would go on and on, right? Khalifa of the Khalifa of the Khalifa of Rasul. You should call yourself Amirul Mu'mineen. And that's why both they subsequently. So they were sort of making it up as they went along, but they were in the context of the Islamic milieu of that time, right? But today, we have this bizarre situation. For example, at one particular university here in the US, they were having a seminar for the MSA on Islamic inheritance laws. And I was there lecturing at that university. So I went there and I said, by the way, are you also going to tell them what the American laws are? Because some of the things that you just said are illegal in this country. Yes. So are you going to advocate that they break the American law? What is really more important for Muslims today is to know what the inheritance process is, how to transfer wealth to your children, how to distribute your wealth, and also make a will, for God's sake. You know, so rather than training Muslims to live in the real world, what the MSA was doing was training them to live in an imaginary caliphate where the Sharia law, as articulated by somebody a few hundred years ago, was implemented. That law is not implemented anywhere. So I think that there is this disjuncture, which is, I think, a fundamental treatment of modernity as illegitimate in the eyes of Muslims. And we have not yet fully come to terms with modernity, and therefore the most important element of modernity, which is the nation state.
Yes.
And so, even though Muslims live in kind of nation states, their conception of citizenship, their allegiance to the law of the land is kind of bifurcated. So they are living in this imaginary Islamic state in their head, and the real state, whether they are in Egypt or Tunisia, so every state appears illegitimate, every legal system appears illegitimate. I mean, we are living in a world at this moment where not only failing and fragile states proliferate in the Muslim world, but the core part of the Muslim world, the Middle East, is essentially a failing region. And I think because Muslims have simply focused on legitimacy and structure of governance rather than good governance.
Mm.
I don't care if Saudi Arabia has a monarchy as long as they are able to deliver good governance. That is more important. Like, we have had democracy in the US the last 4 years, but I don't think we have been delivering good governance. Look at our healthcare crisis, etc. So we have to balance this idea. And so one goal of the book is to ask Muslims to think in terms of good governance. It's more about outcomes of government. Like, is there equity in society? Is there harmony in society? Do you have the freedom to practice your faith and perfect your soul? If this is the objective of human being on this, you have to have tremendous autonomy and freedom of conscience to be able to do tazkiyah nafs, to purify your soul. If you are not free to impact your own soul, how can you become a better person? So to me, that's why I have this extended discussion on freedom in the book, and I argue that. And also, that's why I'm very critical of this concept of the Mahasid al-Sharia approach that is constant. I mean, the 5 Mahasid do not include justice or freedom. So how can you have a society where the people are not free? And so there are serious issues that Muslims need to be talking about from a governance perspective. It is in this context that I have started a project in partnership with IIIT called Islam, Universal Values and Good Governance. And so we are going to do a series of symposiums where we are focusing on good governance. So the first project was actually a symposium on my book where several scholars responded. The next one is authoritarianism and good governance. So you see, with the rise of populism and authoritarianism, we have this very strange dilemma in the world today where democracies like the United States and India are failing their public, and authoritarian regimes like Singapore and China are delivering some essential public goods. They may not give you freedom, but they have given you freedom from COVID, for example. So I have a fear that authoritarian models will become more popular, especially in societies which have not fully embraced liberal values.
Yes.
And so in that context, we really need to talk about good governance and what it means. I think Muslims need to have a global conversation about what is good governance, what would they like to see in their society, not enforcement of certain laws, but in terms of what are the parameters of high levels of education, high levels of health, high levels of happiness. This is what I want them to ask for.
Yes, actually, authoritarianism is growing everywhere, including in so-called established democracy. There was a survey done recently that among the followers of the Republican Party in the US, there is a growing part of it that consider democracy less relevant than other ways of governing. And if you look at surveys done across the youth, which I found the most problematic and worrisome, young people are less and less convinced that democracy is the best way of governance. So there are lots of worrying signs here above Islam or beyond Islam. And I think it would be also good at some point, not everybody, but it's good also to keep an eye on these global trends that cut across even, I would say, the specificity of Islam. Before we keep going, we have already 4 long questions. So I'm going to start with, we're going to take them one by one. So the first one probably refer to the beginning of our discussion. Are there any Muslim majority countries that are moving in this direction that we discussed, in the way they approach governance?
Look, if you had asked me this question 10 years ago, then I would have pointed towards Turkey and Malaysia and to some extent Indonesia as countries which are moving towards focusing and providing good governance. And you could see this in Turkey. The first time I went to Turkey in 2008, and I was surprised at how many things worked. And people were providing good education, they were providing good transportation, the quality of life was improving, the level of income was rising, etc. So just standard measures of good governance you could see in these countries. But now all of these countries are also getting involved in identity politics.
Yes.
And one of the problems with identity politics is that the identity struggles undermine values. People often think that values are an integral part of identity. No, projecting an Islamic identity is one thing, practicing Islamic values is another thing. So for example, if the president or leader of any of these countries would ask me, I want to project my Islamic identity, then I'll say, okay, pass a fatwa against Salman Rushdie, make a conference on Gaza, these symbolic things where you project yourself as a quote unquote Islamic state, enforce hijab on all women, just a few symbolic things. It's like the way we make our car Islamic. We buy a Korean car and then we paint it green, put a number thing 786, hang a tasbih, and okay, it's a halal car now. It's a superficial model. But if you want to practice Islamic values, then the first question I would ask is income disparity. One of Prophet's companions said that there can be no poverty in an Islamic society. There can't be rich people and poor people. You have to ensure that there is distributive justice. That is why we have the concept of zakat. So then practicing Islamic values in a political sense becomes so much more difficult because you have to ensure that there is economic equity. There is no difference between an Arab and a non-Arab. So there can be no social inequities, etc. But there was also this hope after the Arab Spring that with democratization would come good governance in the Muslim world. Unfortunately, the Arab world is this unique example where neither democracy nor by democracy, whatever we see in Jordan and to some extent in Morocco, and under the Muslim Brotherhood's reign in Egypt, nor authoritarian systems have developed and provided good governance.
I would say that Tunisia has, despite all the difficulty and challenge, the evolution of thinking about Islam and governance in Tunisia under the leadership of Ghanouchi has been moving into this direction with all the obstacles that we know, meaning indeed keeping the focus on the institution of the state institution. But that's the problem when you are a political party. But if you see the thinking of Ghanouchi, he has moved in this direction you mentioned about civic or civism, Islamic civism more than Islamic law. And so, but it's maybe too early to tell, and there are too many challenges around this little experience to make it indeed a sort of definitive case.
No, but if you do, say, if you look at Malaysia, for example, to some extent, there are serious policy discussions about good governance, how to improve the quality of education, how to improve the condition of women. There are backlashes going on, how to integrate non-Muslim minorities, right? There are much more sophisticated debates going on. And the reason why those things are happening is because there is a modicum of democratic institutions, there is a modicum of freedom of speech, etc. So Erdogan is famous for saying that that democracy is not the destination; it is the train that will take you somewhere, right? And people have been critical of him, saying that, well, basically it meant that he will establish his own caliphate or dictatorship on this train using democracy. But I think that, look, democracy is a way of eliminating, it's a conflict resolution process within a state. If there are competing interests, the best way to resolve conflict is to democracy. It is not a guarantee of good governance. And 4 years of Donald Trump have convinced us that democracy is not necessarily going to deliver good governance. You need something more than just a democratic structure. But Muslims need some kind of democracy in order to be able to articulate competing visions of governance. Yeah. And so that there is autonomy. Like, I should not be afraid that if I challenge this particular policy, they're going to respond by hanging me. I think of Mahmoud Taha of Sudan, for example. So if I'm convinced that, okay, they may reject my idea, but they're not going to hang me, then I will feel free to advance and create a debate and an environment. And it is through this process of tadabbur, deliberation, it is through this process of shura or consultation that better policies can be articulated. I argue in the book that we need 4 freedoms. Muslims need the freedom to do ijtihad, both Islamic law. Muslims need the freedom to also challenge past consensus. This whole idea of shutting down Islamic debate by saying, oh, we have an ijma on this. And I have the standard answer. If I'm not part of the ijma, there is no ijma for me. I don't care if all the Muslim world don't consider me as a scholar. I consider myself as a scholar of Islam. If I don't agree, there is no ijma. I should have the freedom to challenge the past ijma. And if it is valid, then a re-examination should merely reinforce it, right? So we need to have freedom to do ijtihad. We need to have freedom to do ijma. And Muslims should also have the freedom not to fear the reprisals of state when they're critical of the governance of the state. And I think that is very important. It is only through creation of a self-critical society that we can improve. That's why this ihsan and tasawwuf is very important. There is a process called murahaba and muhasaba. Murahaba is vigilance, to keep an eye on yourself. Is what I'm doing the right thing? Is what I'm doing the correct thing? We use it only in spiritual sense. Did I pray 5 times today? Did I do my wudu properly? Is my beard of proper length? But beyond that, murahaba is not used. And then muhasaba is to keep an account, to be accountable. These needs to be institutionalized. And it is not difficult. In the past, Muslims did have institutionalization of muhasaba. We also have the GAO in the United States, right? Government Accountability Organization, whatever it's called, that keeps track of government accountability. So Muslims need to be able to create this self-critical society which will constantly work. It's like improving yourself every day. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, if you are the same person 2 days in a row, consider yourself a loser, which means you have missed 24 hours to become a better person. And the same thing should apply to a society, that it should constantly be improving or it will decay.
Thank you. So there is another question. It's a little long, so I'm going to cut to the chase. Using Aristotle or Plato as contradiction, what socio-political framework may be best used to bridge the framework? I'm not sure to understand, but also using Christendom as a comparison. How may conservative thought moderate public or present eschatological pools? I'm not sure I'm following this question.
Well, Islamic political philosophy is very interesting. I imagine Muslim philosophers standing in this posture, where they have one hand in front and one hand in the back. In the hand in the front, they have Plato. So they are showing Plato, and they are hiding Aristotle behind constantly, because the philosophy is driven by Aristotle. And the most important part is causality. And if Muslims philosophers realize that the idea of causality contradicted with certain theological assumptions of decree and qadar, etc., that only God creates things, etc. There is no causality to things because then even miracles are called into question, etc., right? So, but without causality, you cannot have science. And so philosophers were particularly sensitive and tried to protect Aristotle. But I have a feeling that some of the best work in Islamic philosophy has been inspired by Aristotle. Ibn Khaldun's methodology is Aristotelian. Ibn Rushd is Aristotelian. Ibn Sina is Aristotelian. Farabi is more like Plato. But, Ibn Sina said that he did not understand Aristotle until he read Farabi. So it is important to understand that Islamic civilization, if it were to pursue the philosophical paradigm of politics of creating a state of individuals who are intellectually sophisticated, this dream of philosophers to have a philosopher king and we are actually moving towards that. People don't understand that having 30% college graduates in a country is an extremely sophisticated society, as opposed to in the past where only 5%, 10% people were literate. Even governors and rulers were not literate in the past, but today we have lawyers running the country. So we are capable of producing a society where knowledge is very important. I mean, the World Bank has been talking about knowledge-based economies. Why can't we talk about knowledge-based politics? I mean, this age of fake news and fake interpretations contradicts that perspective. But I think that for a good Islamic state based on ihsan values, Muslims have to know their tradition well, right? They have to know what is ihsan. And Muslims have to be extremely literate in their own tradition to be able to apply their values today. So in that sense, the Aristotelian and Neoplatonic models can be beneficial.
Yes. Just a bifurcation question here. I'm not sure that Muslims have the institutions around them to be able to learn that tradition. That's a major challenge. Think of the potential if your kind of thinking was part of a structural effort to educate the new generation, that's what is missing, and that's, I think, why most of the modern states in Muslim world have failed in this incapacity to maintain the tradition alive, and the loss of religiously grounded thinking independent of the state. This has been, I would say, for Islam, the kiss of death, if I may say so. So there is a real challenge here. And for a while, I came to this country, I was a little naive. I thought that Islam could thrive outside this control and nationalization of Islam. And it has been a challenge here too. I'm not talking only about America. I come from Europe, so the situation is even worse over there to some extent. So this is a real challenge here. Where do we find these new spaces? So
it is what you're pointing is very troubling. So for example, did you know that Ibn Khaldun taught at Al-Azhar University? This is in the 13th and 14th century beginning, right? But he was not taught at Al-Azhar until 1905 or 1915, when Muhammad Abdu was Sheikh Al-Azhar. He actually fought to include Ibn Khaldun in the syllabus. So to me, it is very, to be frank, for example, this book has been out for a few months now, and except for one invitation from Turkey and some discussions in Bosnia, I have not got any invitations from Muslim countries to talk about it. Muslim countries are interested in inviting only those American Muslims to talk to them who repeat to them what they already know. So if you're going to Turkey to talk about Ghazali, there are better scholars of Ghazali sitting in Turkey and in other parts of the Muslim world. So I really don't understand. And they don't have these institutions where they can do as much independent research, free from government interference. Like when I was writing the book, I was not really worried at all about what the U.S. government is going to say or not, you know. And I wrote it as a believer, paid the price of not going to a university press where they loved the book, but they did like the fact that I was writing it as a believer, you know. And I had a very heated exchange with a very prominent academic press. And my last statement to that editor was, I said, you know what, I'm not going to stop being a believer, but I guarantee you, you are not going to publish this book, but you will probably publish 100 books on this book. You know, so you will not publish a book. I mean, if Maududi sent his book to, say, Cambridge University Press, they would not, but they would publish 100 dissertations written on Maududi's book and work. So there are limitations and pressures even in the West for intellectual thought, but that is more about if you want academic success. But if you're not interested in just academic success, but you want to think freely and impact the Muslim world, and I see no restrictions about it. There's nobody who stopped me from writing and publishing and sharing like I am doing right now. And so that is an important part. And for that, you need freedom of thought. And without freedom of thought, there will be no progress in the Muslim world. You cannot have good governments without freedom. Even in authoritarian regimes, you know, there are these consultative bodies where businesses consult with the government. And if you are afraid of the government, you're not going to give them correct data, and the government then cannot make good policies. But if you trust the government, then you will share data. So in the past, businesses shared data with Chinese government, so the Chinese government can make good policies. The same in Japan and other parts where there has to be autonomy to share the truth. Otherwise, we will not be able to chart a path that will lead towards progress and development.
Thank you. We have a few more questions and 10 minutes, so I may group a few of them together if you don't mind and address.
Sure.
So the next one is about the extent to which Sharia allows for contextualization of matters of governance in regard to time and place. And then there is another one on the West, and in the West there is a particular conception of Islam as something bad. There is a danger of Muslims colluding with that in a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. How do you think they should respond instead? Meaning they as against the Muslims. Then I have a question on Islamic countries. Where would both of you presenting place the religious maturity of the people, Ummah of Islam? How would you rate their relationship with minorities who are in the neighbors? Also, I think of the cultural separation of Islamic country, Arab world, Turkey, Iran, etc. Is it valid to break them down by culture? And the last question is, in terms of education, being self-critical isn't part of the problem, that we're talking among modern Western social scientists rather than in the mosque, hence in Islamic university. So how can we actually bring these kinds of discussions to the mosques?
Well, let me start with the first question, and I forgot what was the first question.
First question was about Sharia and contextualization.
Yes. So, for example, there is this famous episode that everybody talks about Imam Shafi'i, who, while he was in Baghdad, he was always debating the Hanafis and defending the Maliki school. And then when he came to Cairo, he started debating the Malikis and disagreeing with them. So when he was asked about an opinion, he gave an answer, and someone said, well, when you were in Baghdad, you gave a different answer to the same question. And so Imam Shafi'i said, that was there, this is here, that was then, this is now. So where he very clearly said, with variation in space and time, you can have a different answer to the same question. So in that sense, he very clearly tried to send the message that the context in which Islam is understood can change. So, I mean, there is a traditional way of thinking that if the illah changes, the hukum changes. So if the context can change, then the judgment will also change. Muslims Muslims need to know this. Ordinary Muslims need to know. The problem is not even the scholars of Islam. They know this stuff. They're just scared to death of the ordinary people. So what happens is, rather than elevating the ordinary people to the level of the scholars are coming down to the level of the ordinary people. So even in the mosque, the last question about the mosques, usually the imam and the most educated person is not the mufti of the mosque. It is this doctor who writes the biggest check, the biggest donor of the mosque is the interpreter of Islamic law. If the imam comes up with an interpretation which is inconsistent with the biggest donor, then he is in trouble. So I find that the dumbest or the least informed and the most powerful elements of the society control the interpretation of Islamic law and not the scholars. And until mosques come up with a tenure system for their imams and their scholars, then there will be no autonomy. I also give a lot of sermons, and I say what I want to say. Sometimes mosques will never ever invite me back again, and there are others who will invite me, and then there will be one mosque tapes my videos, videotapes every sermon of mine, because if there are bad things being spread, lies, we can at least go back and check and say, did he say that? Did he say that? And I find it quite astonishing that people who really don't know what I'm talking about. So for example, at the beginning of COVID, I was talking about how Ibn Sina had come up with this idea of quarantine during, and even the Prophet, one of the hadith is about shelter in place, you know. So I was saying that Muslims already talked about quarantining. Why are we finding this problematic? And the response was, Ibn Sina is a Shia. So we don't want to. So how do you deal with these issues, right? These very narrow ways of thinking, lack of openness to ideas. And I think that comes from an insecurity. I think most average Muslims know that they don't know about Islam. So they do not want to hear anything new, because then they won't be able to judge its validity. If they hear a new idea, they don't know whether it is valid. So for example, when I said to make eye contact with God, I had people saying, Nauzubillah and Astaghfirullah. And I said, what are you talking about? This concept of mushahada is so common. It's even in the Quran. You know, of Moses going and saying, Rabbi Arini Unzur, like, oh God, show thyself so I can see you. This is part of the Quran. And then he just said, oh, I didn't know. I said, you didn't know, but you didn't hesitate to judge me, right? So this judgment from the ignorant, I think, is a curse of the Muslim world at the moment.
Yeah, that's I think the biggest loss is there was a built-in pluralism in the Islamic thinking that has been lost, and so I think that's the biggest challenge also for you, thinking outside this current dominant consensus and an homogeneous way of going to Islam. And for me, that's always a question, but that's my political science bias, to think about what are the institutions that could be created around this new thinking.
Well, I think the institutions are the solution, whether you're political or not. I mean, some of the greatest things that the Khulafa Rashidin, for example, did were to create the Baitul Mal, etc., right? Some of the great innovations that we attribute to the second caliph are the institutions that he created to realize these values. And I think whether you're talking about bringing ihsan into society or bringing good governance, these are products of good institutions. And if institutions are weakened, I mean, in the last 2 years or the last 1 year, one of the negatives of the current dispensation in Washington is that it is weakening the very institutions that are critical to our democracy. So democracy is not something that we write in our constitution or just go and vote in November. It is various institutions. For example, the checks and balances. If the Congress is not challenging the president, we don't have checks and balances in this country. It may be written in the constitution, but if the institution is not functioning as the institution is designed to do, then it is not. So yes, I think institutions are the places, and I think for Muslims, what we need is primary is to build great universities. So I often say jokingly, I can raise money like this to get a golden bathroom for a mosque, but not for a library.
Yeah.
There are no libraries in very many mosques. So what are we talking about? We are leaving our children to learn from YouTube, you know. And so that is one of the things. To the community has to become knowledge intensive. It has to understand modern knowledge about modernity, to understand how to live in modernity, and it also has to know what the fundamental principles of its faith are if it is going to internalize and practice that faith. Otherwise, it's going to live superficially in the modern world and superficially in the Islamic world.
We have come to our conclusion, and I think it's a best way to conclude. So I would like to thank our audience, and of course, thank you, Muqtader Khan, for your lively and passionate contribution.
Yes, get a copy.
Thank you very much, and see you maybe on another setting, on another Zoom.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I also want to thank everybody who was here and listening and participating. And thank you for the great question.
It's a wonderful team, make things happen.
Yes, thank you for Ruth also for helping us.
Ruth,
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.